Good morning and welcome to the Solutions Journalism Network Conversations with Educators. I am Francine Huff, the Director of Journalism School Partnerships at the Solutions Journalism Network. And I am here today with two faculty members from the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. Both of these wonderful educators have implemented solutions journalism in their reporting courses and have helped students create some amazing projects focused on reporting in local neighborhoods in New York City. We'll discuss their work and some of their key takeaways from working with students on the Bronx's Buffering and Solutions NYC multimedia projects. Welcome, Judith and Will.
Hi, thanks for having us.
So first we have Judy Watson, an associate professor and the acting director of reporting and writing, who was the associate dean of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism from its inception in 2006 until the end of 2014. She started at CUNY as a special assistant to former Chancellor Matthew Goldstein, overseeing new projects for the university. Prior to that, she spent 15 years at United Press International, serving as New York Bureau Chief, New York State Editor, and Albany Capitol Bureau Chief. In a 25-year journalism career, Watson has worked as a columnist, reporter, and print and broadcast editor. We also have with us Will Cruz, an executive editor with the News Standards team at ABC News. He has more than 20 years experience working in print, digital, and broadcast. A member of the NAHJ, NABJ, and AAJA, Will has helped work toward diversifying newsrooms through recruiting and mentoring. He is also an adjunct lecturer at CUNY, where he teaches solutions journalism. All right, so let's just get into our discussion. So the Newmark J School has implemented solutions journalism into its curriculum across several classes. And for people who may be new to solutions journalism is rigorous, evidence-based reporting focused on responses to social issues. So Judy, let's start with you. Why do you feel it is important to teach students to use this approach when covering stories?
I think that students are naturally inclined towards a solutions approach. And I think that after years of reading problem after problem and the same problems being talked about and reported upon, people are anxious to hear, all right, so what are we going to do about them? And I think, again, this is a natural inclination of students. You know, they know that they've had a lot of, their generation has had a lot of problems dumped on them. And so they are much more fixated on solutions. And we see that even in, almost an activist approach to some issues.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned activism. This younger generation definitely is more engaged in activism. But what would you say to students about what is the difference between activism and solutions, or are they really tied together?
I think they come from the same impetus, but we do, have to rein in students sometimes in terms of, dealing with facts, dealing with evidence, and then, not injecting opinion certainly into pieces. But I think that, they do run along some of the same threads. It's just, solutions takes advantage of the activist impetus and tries to channel it in a constructive way.
That's a great way to see it. Will, why do you think it's important to teach students about solutions journalism?
To Judy's point, I think they're already on that track. Unlike when I learned journalism, where it was, strictly the facts and point out problems, highlight problems, and some accountability, but not entirely. I think students are hungry to point out what's wrong in their communities and highlight them and, to the point of activism, I think it's just supported by really good, deep journalism. So, I think journalism is changing where people are hiding their bias less, and that's okay as long as it's supported by, good research, good journalism, everything that we learned.
Yeah, I think, what would you say to maybe journalists who've been in the business for a while who are very resistant to that idea that more of the opinion creeps in a little bit more, or just maybe that activist bent? Like, how would you convince those folks that there is value in reporting stories through that solutions lens?
Yeah, I think it's a work in progress, and I'm evidence of that. I went into this as a skeptic. Judy can tell you, I'm still processing it because it's unlearning a lot of behavior that I practiced over the course of my career. So it's unlearning that, but it's also, the last 2 years with the pandemic, with George Floyd, everything has changed. And I think students leaning into their bias and their activism is that it's okay. It's okay. Again, as long as it's supported by, what we do as journalists.
I also think that journalists are solutions journalism is really a natural extension of reporting. Whenever I did my own reporting, I always, the end question was, okay, and who's doing something about this? And so it's just pointing out, just putting a little more emphasis on that end of the story and the equation. We have investigative reporting, a very good investigative reporting class course, but and sometimes it gets into the, okay, what's next? But sometimes it's simply, it is accountability journalism. And then the solutions course is sort of a natural extension of that. Okay, now what's being done about this?
Mm-hmm. So tell me, how have you actually gone about incorporating solutions journalism into your actual curriculum? Because I know the two of you both teach reporting courses, but Judy, your course focuses on all different types of writing, not just solutions. And Will, you taught a course that was fully a solutions journalism course.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me, and let's start first, Will, with you. Talk to me about, like, what was your experience, or how did you go about implementing that as a full course focused on solutions?
I got to say, so we started with the structure of it being a solutions journalism course. So that part was easy. What I thought would be more of a challenge would be convincing the students in the same way that I needed convincing. And I was completely wrong about that. The students were all in, and they wanted it, and they reported. And, my challenge was, as we discussed, in our last conversation, my challenge was making sure that before they go full speed ahead into the solutions, that they've got the foundation of the journalism. So I almost had to take a step back and make sure that, hey, yes, we're framing this course and we're framing our work around solutions, but we still need the basic fundamentals of good reporting and good journalism.
Yeah, and I would imagine that a lot of professors find that same issue, that they may have students even at different levels in the same course, some who maybe get the basics of story structure and writing leads and the nut graphs and all of that. And then other students maybe are still trying to work toward just getting a good lead written.
Yeah.
So,
I will say, Francine, if I could just add, as another way to kind of credit this generation of journalists, when I was learning journalism, it was far more cutthroat, I think. And whoever was left behind was left behind. And I think now that students, there's this camaraderie where the stronger students help those who need more help. And they may not even know it, but they're learning from those struggling students. So it's very, it's impressive to watch.
Wow, that's really an interesting dynamic that you're pointing out.
Yeah.
And they also bring different lived experience
Yes.
to the reporting. And so they do learn from each other that way as
It's a
well.
great point. Yeah.
So Judy, how do you implement solutions into your, it's an advanced reporting course, I believe, right?
Well, there are actually two courses in which we did this. One was an editing course, and my students who were editing created a project and then invited first semester students to contribute to that project, the next New York. And so it was sort of one step away, but it was also overseeing the editors who were editing this project and keeping everybody on track with the theme. In the second course, it is an advanced reporting course that reports in the South Bronx for our two South Bronx newspapers. The school has run two South Bronx newspapers for 15 years. And so they're reporting for that. But in the process of reporting, we also decided we wanted to take a deeper dive into the problem of low internet connectivity in the Bronx, particularly during the pandemic.
And what is the name of that project that you?
The Bronx is buffering.
The Bronx is Buffering is the project that Judy Watson worked on with her students at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. And we're here having a conversation with editors for educators for the Solutions Journalism Network. So Judy, tell us a little bit more about just how you prepared the students to go out, because what struck me with that project, as well as the project that Will worked on with his students, was that it was completed during this past year of COVID. Was still an issue. And yet it looked like the students had really good local sourcing. So can you talk about that and just how that came about?
In the Bronx is buffering. We at least, after a year of lockdown in New York City, pretty much, where at one point we would not allow our students to do any reporting outside of their own apartments. So students were excited about being able to be back out on the street. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is really physically getting to the South Bronx and really engaging with the community, so that not only we understand their issues, but they also do not view us, the press, as sort of these sort of extraterrestrial creatures, and we really want to feel like we're part of the community, and we want them to feel that way as well, even as we serve as accountability journalists as well.
Yeah, and it seems, do you feel, and either one of you, Judy, do you feel that that kind of being out there, that sourcing, do you feel that made it maybe a little easier for them to find the stories that did fit that solutions model?
Sure. When we talk to community leaders, particularly nonprofit directors, about how to engage with their communities, they consistently, it's like, you have to be here, you have to be up here with us, you have to be talking to us, you have to be, we want to be understood. We know all the problems here. And don't show us as being this dangerous, poor place. Show us as being a real thriving community that actually has taken many steps to solve its own problems because government failed them.
Yeah. And getting out in the community and these communities that sometimes are not being covered as much is part of the point of solutions journalism. Yes. Will, can you talk about that a little bit in terms of the project that you worked on with your students?
There were still challenges, if I'm being honest. It was, if I remember correctly, half the students were eager to go back out and the other half just weren't ready. And, my job as the teacher was to not heap too much praise on those who went out and engaged in the community because they felt safer, and still give enough support to those who still weren't ready to report in person and had to report remotely. So it was a challenge, and it was, for me, it was the first time we were doing it. So we didn't have the history as we do in the South Bronx. So they covered the entire city. So it was harder to really get engaged in one community. So if I were to do it again, I think maybe we would do that differently and focus on one borough or one section of a borough and really just dig in. So.
So you went, so your students were going, like, were they going to like multiple neighborhoods, or how did that, where were they going?
Yeah,
it on one neighborhood, like how wide ranging was it?
It was finding solutions across the whole city. So it was, students lived in Queens and that was convenient for them considering the COVID restrictions. I think that's the approach that we took, because if a student lived in Queens and she wanted to report in Corona because she felt safer there, we didn't want to discourage that. So we just broadened it out and covered the entire city. For better or worse, it still turned out to be good, but we didn't get the deep reporting in one neighborhood as we would normally in a course like this.
So for those who are still learning about what solutions journalism is, solutions journalism, there's 4 principles of solutions journalism to keep in mind when you're working on a story. First, the story needs to cover a response to a problem and how that response works. Second, it needs to provide evidence of impact, looking at the effectiveness, not just intentions. And it needs to produce insights that can help others respond as well. And fourth, it needs to point out any limitations or caveats of the response that is being discussed. So Judy, can you talk a little bit about those points, and were there any particular areas that the students had more difficulty with when they tried to get the 4 principles into their story?
Again, because we weren't coming at this, we weren't teaching the 4 tenets of solutions. We were coming at it from a more organic viewpoint. We got, I would say organically, we got to about 1.5 out of the 4, maybe 2 out of the 4, where we didn't, again, much of the semester in the Bronx class was taken up reporting stories and, for these two news sites. And so we were able to take maybe 6 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, to focus on this, even as we continued to provide stories for the sites. And so the depth of what we were able to accomplish is not at the level of, true solutions journalism, but it was a step in the direction, and it was a step that, as Will said, students really wanted to take. And I think that, maybe those students in future semesters, or even as they go into their jobs, will want to dig even further. And that gets around to, having one course to focus on this, and maybe even having a couple of students working on one project, to really do a deep dive. I think that's, we have something called a capstone that all students must complete in order to graduate. And I think that's a perfect place for a solutions journalism approach, because you have the time and the requirement that you really go much deeper than otherwise,
And Will, because you had a full semester course, did you find that your students were, in many cases or some cases, successful with getting the 4 points across?
Yeah, it for the most part, yes. And I think, again, I blended it with some of our, some of the teachings that Judy and I have done in our craft courses, where it's the basics of journalism. And since some of the students, it was a second semester course, but since some of the students either didn't take our first craft class or just needed a refresher, I found it more effective to blend some of the 4 principles in with just the basic teachings of journalism. And what I found at the very beginning of this semester, which is the craft semester, the craft course that we teach, is that a lot of the principles of solutions journalism is kind of blending into the very fundamentals that I'm teaching now. So, I remember, I've been editing our first enterprise stories now, and many of my edits have been like, where's the accountability? What are the limitations? Be careful not to lionize people or make heroes of them, hold people accountable, vet the nun, things like that.
Well, it sounds like you were the best student in your class.
Yes, I was. Yeah. No, but I found that in a great way. I think that, the courses and the teachings are blending since I've done them back to back to back. And that's a positive, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think, when you teach these journalism classes, you get different students each semester.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes the courses, just like you said, organically just are a little different from the previous semester.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times you do learn things from some of the students in the courses and how to adapt. So what would you do differently next time teaching your course in how you implement solutions or go about getting the projects to turn out the way you want?
Yeah, I think I would do 2 things differently. One, I mentioned, being rooted in a neighborhood. And I hope that as we head into the spring, that we open up a little more as far as COVID restrictions, so we can report in person a little more. I think I would do that differently. And maybe, again, every class is different and the needs will be different, but maybe assign fewer, we do stories throughout the semester, and we'll do spot stories and, cover press conferences just to make sure those basic reporting skills remain intact. I may do fewer of those so that they can devote more time to the end project, to deeper reporting. So I think I would do that differently.
What about you, Judy? What would you do differently?
Well, again, I think that this solutions journalism requires a much deeper approach than, when you start to document not just evidence, that something worked, and sometimes nobody's measuring that, and so the reporter ends up having to almost become the measurer, and that is not an easy thing to do, again, for students who are learning journalism to begin with. But then also, I certainly do think that documenting the limitations and getting them out there and stating them, and maybe focusing a little more on the replicability, which is one of the sort of tenets of. So yeah, I would probably give students a little longer to work on this, maybe get them thinking about it much earlier in the semester, even though it's not the focus of this course. The focus of this course is, reporting on the South Bronx community. In the editing course, actually, that was really a one-off almost, because we were in the middle of the pandemic, and now the editing course is actually helping to edit the South Bronx news sites. But I can see talking about solutions journalism in that class and pushing them to push the students they're working with towards those goals.
What kind of feedback did you get from those editing students who worked on those projects? Just
they they did a nice job of pushing the students to, document things going on, and of course shape their stories, because these were first semester students. They were working with the editing students were third semester students. And we've discovered that pairing those two groups is a great learning tool as well, for both sides. And they had to not only select the project, but also then sell it to their colleagues, and then make sure that it all fit together. And that was also one of my roles, making sure that we all stayed on track. And even though I had some stories that I thought, oh, we really should be tracking this, and I'd throw it out there, but if nobody sort of felt compelled, it didn't speak to them, nobody chose it, and that had to be okay with me, so, hands on, hands off.
How much, in our last few minutes left, how much will like your revision or your submission process, like how much back and forth was there with the students in terms of, them having feedback or redoing stories or having like checkpoints during the semester?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's the one benefit of submitting more stories throughout the course of the semester, is that they receive more feedback. I taught with Judy for 2 courses, I think, and she would always encourage students to submit rewrites. And it's good. I think you get 1 round of editing, and that's great. And another part of the exercise is what the students do and what they learn, and to apply it right away. So we did do some of the rewrites during the solutions journalism course. But again, it just never, one semester never feels like enough time. Because when you're one professor and you're editing 1 round of stories, and then you're editing rewrites, and you're trying to maintain the vision of the entire course, you can just never do everything you want to do, for me anyway. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Judy, are there any last thoughts you'd like to share about your experience implementing solutions into your curriculum that might help other educators?
I think that actually, even though we didn't get as deep as I would like in terms of implementing the full range of sort of principles that solutions journalism espouses, I think that introducing it and getting students to be thinking about it will, even early in their education, even in their program, they will lean more and more into that. And if you give the tools and say, okay, this is how it works, and be thinking about this, as they go forward with other stories that they report, they will again, I believe the natural inclination is to do this anyway, particularly today. But I think that, again, giving more and more tools to know how to do it, you'll see more and more of it in reporting, even if that is not the focus of the course.
Yeah, and I mean, really, that's the goal, is to normalize covering stories as you would any other approach, whether it's an enterprise, a feature, or an investigative, so that, journalists are automatically thinking this is a format that I should consider no matter what. Not all stories will fit the solutions, model, but certainly just thinking about that and getting your students to think about that definitely helps to normalize it. Yeah, you're right about that. Will, is there any last thoughts that you would like to share about your experience that might help other educators?
Yeah, I think for me it was easy because the structure was built in as a solutions course. But again, some of that is blending into what I'm teaching now in our craft course. And to Judy's point, I think it's happening so organically. I see it in young coworkers of mine, where they'll write a story and, maybe a few paragraphs below the nut graph, it's a solutions nut graph, if you will. And it's happening, it's happening quickly. And I think to the extent that we can offer students that structure and make it a part of the foundation that we teach, it'll continue happening.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Judy Watson and Will Cruz, for being here today for the Solutions Journalism Network conversation with educators. And I am Francine Huff, the Director of Journalism School Partnerships at SJN, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.